This Saturday night at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Central Time, we have the conclusion to the SEC regular season with the 2024 SEC Championship game between 5th-ranked 10-2, 6-2 in SEC play Georgia Bulldogs, led by Kirby Smart, the best head coach in all of college football right now, and the 2nd-ranked 11-1, 7-1 in SEC play Texas Longhorns. A rematch of a regular season game in Austin where the Georgia Bulldogs won 30-15 in a stunning upset. At the time, Texas was ranked as the #1 team in the country. The Longhorns are currently favored by 2.5 points after the line opened up as essentially a pick'em, as an even spread, and Texas is given a 61.4% chance to win this football game. I am going to be giving you a preview and prediction for this matchup. There are really, if I'm got to be honest here, there aren't really any surprises to this matchup. This is the matchup that a lot of people picked in the preseason, and for a few weeks now, it's felt like, especially ever since that Georgia win over Texas, that this was going to be the inevitable matchup in the SEC championship game. Obviously, Georgia lost to Ole Miss, but even then, there were tie-breaking situations that ultimately broke in Georgia's favor because of how tough their conference strength of schedule has been. They faced one of the toughest schedules in the country, and we'll talk about that. Texas has faced an easier schedule, but they have one of the most, if not the most, dominant defense in the country. They have talent on offense, and they're 11-1 right now. And outside of that loss to Georgia, they have looked in control of every one of their football games. And it's not like Georgia blew them out either. That was a game in the third quarter after Georgia started off very hot. But the Bulldogs, as they typically do under Kirby Smart, once they establish a lead, once they establish game control, they finish because they're coached by one of the best head coaches, the best head coach, and one of the best staffs in all of America. Before I give you my analysis and also my prediction at the end of the video, I ask you to score a touchdown for college football with Sam and do these 7 things. At least do 6 of them. If you want to kick the extra point, you can. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts, your prediction, and some analysis you have on this matchup because you probably see something that I don't, and you might mention something that I may look into when I do my deep dive tomorrow on this game, along with my deep dive on Penn State versus Oregon. I already have a preview and prediction video out for that if you want to check that out. Also, share the video around, join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. If we could have more SEC fans in our College Football with Sam Discord server, that would be incredible. We're mainly a Big Ten channel. We're the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, trying to become one of the best college football channels on YouTube, the best college football channel on YouTube, and you can help us out with that goal by subscribing. We also, in the next week or two, I'm going to be doing a giveaway for reaching 20,000 subscribers to celebrate that. If you want to support the channel monetarily, you can super chat in the comment section below or sign up as a paid member of our Patreon page or purchase merchandise via our merchandise store. The links to those 2 things are in the description or down below in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. But let's talk about this game here and look at things from the bird's eye view, from the broad perspective, and then dive deeper into some position battles, into, well, our prediction, and also some coaching advantages that these 2 teams have over each other. By the power ratings, Texas is a consensus, really unanimous favorite here, but it's not by a whole lot of points. It's predicted to be a close game. Texas is favored by 4.9 points per FPI. When you just look at things from a neutral field standpoint, Texas is favored by about 1.5 points per S&P plus. And according to my PPI, the potential power index, they are favored by 3.5 points. Again, this is taking into account neutral field. I don't know if FPI or S&P Plus really care about travel. It's not like Oregon traveling to Indianapolis, like multiple time zones away. Texas is just 1 time zone away, and Austin is much closer to Atlanta than Eugene is to Indianapolis. Much, much closer. So I don't know if FPI and S&P Plus are taking that into account. But I think it's an advantage to be the team that isn't traveling as far. Again, it's not as big of a factor as the Big Ten championship game or perhaps maybe SMU traveling to the ACC championship game, though it's a pretty similar distance. It's not too big of a factor, but I think that may be something to keep in mind, that the SEC championship game is in Atlanta. It could be treated very well as a Georgia home game. You don't have the same type of dominant advantage that Georgia does if this game were played in Sanford. But I remember back in 2021 when Georgia and Alabama played, and it was 41-24 Alabama final, the ratio of Georgia and Alabama fans were like 75% Georgia fans, 25% Alabama fans. So that is something to keep in mind here, that Georgia may have a bit of a home field advantage. You look at points per play margin, you look at expected points added margin. The Bulldogs have played a very tough strength of schedule, so their points per play margin probably underrates how good of a team they are. It's only a 0.149 points per play margin, which is not even close to the top 10. That means per every one of Georgia's plays compared to one of their opponent's plays on an average basis, they score 0.149 more points. As for expected points added margin, Georgia is a bit underperforming. They're expected to score about 1/5, 0.198 to be exact, more points per one of their plays compared to one of their opponent's plays. But Carson Beck has thrown a lot of interceptions, and Georgia's offense has been inconsistent all season long, and it's not the same with their defense. Their defense is one of the nation's best, but it's not Ohio State caliber. It's probably not Texas caliber, although the Georgia defense came to play in a bigger way than the Texas defense did when they played each other in that individual game. But that's just a one-game sample out of the 12 that they have played. One of the biggest games, the biggest game for Texas, one of the biggest, if not the biggest game for Georgia as well, maybe outside of that road trip to Alabama or maybe the road trip to Ole Miss. I mean, Georgia has played a wicked schedule. It is a schedule that I would not wish on my worst enemy, if I am being honest with you. Texas's points per play margin is a 0.299. Their expected points added margin is a 0.272. So, yes, strength of schedule does play a part in whether you have a high or low points per play margin, but these things typically play out as the season ends, and typically the teams that are higher at the end of the regular season in points per play margin are going to be your national title contenders. A look at Michigan last year, led the nation in points per play margin for much of the year, had an easy strength of schedule, but by the end of their 15-0 run, they had one of the toughest strength of schedules in the country because of who they played in the playoffs, and they played Ohio State. They were number one by a hefty margin. It was the same thing with Georgia in 2021. Played an SEC schedule regular season, even got blown out by Bama in the SEC championship game, but they were number one in points per play margin by a long shot with a tough strength of schedule because of who they played in the postseason that year, and they won it all. So it's something that you do have to tweak. You have to think about it. You have to apply critical thinking, but don't overthink it also. Like, points per play margin isn't totally invalid if the strength of schedules are different, but it also isn't completely valid if there is a huge disparity. And to a certain degree, there is. It's not like Indiana and Ohio State's strength of schedule disparity when they had their matchup, but Georgia's got the third toughest strength of schedule here, and Texas is 32nd. That's the difference of a game or two, but a very important game, like Texas traveling to Ole Miss, or Texas somehow playing Georgia twice in the regular season, for example. So Georgia, a big part of the reason why they are 10-2 is not just because, in my opinion, and I think the analytics and how the eye test, how all that plays out, they're not just one of the worst football teams under Kirby Smart in the 2020s, in that decade, but they also have the toughest regular season schedule that I think a Kirby Smart team has faced in quite some time, for sure. Regardless of that, though, they're 12th in game control. Game control is how would every college football team do against the average top 25 team, and then how they would do, or how they think the average top 25 team in college football would do with said team's schedule. That all is ranked. So I don't know if that made much sense, but basically Georgia would be viewed as as being the 12th best team when it comes to controlling their schedule. So Texas is number 1 in game control, for example. So the computers think that Texas would perform at a higher level, perhaps a significantly higher level, with Georgia's schedule than Georgia would. And also that Georgia would not do as well with Texas's schedule as Texas has. Georgia is 10th in efficiency. Texas is also number 1 in efficiency, same with game control, and they've played the 32nd toughest strength of schedule. I think that in this game, the key matchup here is something that was mostly negated in their first face-off, where both teams just had so many turnovers, particularly Texas, that neither offense had to be excessively productive to win, especially Georgia's. Georgia's defense got so many sacks and forced so many turnovers and put themselves in enough favorable positions to where they got some pretty advantageous and easy points. Now, of course, they did score some touchdowns. They did have a few, not a lot, but a few productive drives. However, with that many turnovers in a matchup such as that, you got to think that that's not the norm. I mean, let me read you some statistics from the 30-15. It's a weird score already. You typically don't see a 30-15 final score in college football. Georgia, 3 turnovers, 283 total yards, 14 first downs, 30 minutes, 26 seconds of possession. Beck had a QBR of 64.8, didn't even average 5 yards per pass attempt. 3 picks, 0 touchdowns, 23 completions, 41 attempts. The reason his QBR is that high is probably because he began a lot of his snaps in opponent territory, and ESPN's QBR has a lot to do with expected points added. Quinn Ewers had a 20.3 QBR. Arch Manning had a 12.3. Georgia ran the ball for over 100 yards, but not even 4 yards per carry, and Texas only had 1 sack. So they didn't get that good of a push on their O-line, but the difference was Texas only ran for 29 yards. Wisner led the team with 52 yards, and when you don't adjust for sacks, they only averaged 1.1 yards per carry because Georgia had 7 sacks and 10 TFLs, and they just totally blew the game up, humiliated what at the time was unanimously viewed practically as the nation's number 1 offensive line. It was, to be frank, I think it was one of the most impressive wins of Kirby Smart's career, because we saw through the month of November and when Georgia played Florida, for example, I mean, this team is limited. This is not the Georgia team of 21, of 22. I think the Georgia team of 2023 is much better than this team. On defense, no. But what Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey and the system that Georgia had last year and a deeper and better O-line, those things I think a lot of Georgia fans would take back right now, because I think the 2023 Georgia team would probably win it all this year, or at least be more of a favorite and be in a more advantageous position to do so than this Georgia team. But all of that aside, that's just a preview of what I think the key matchup is here, because I think it's Georgia's passing offense against a Texas secondary that has been wonderful this year. It's been the complete opposite of last year's Texas secondary. Last year's Texas secondary was gutter trash. It was horrible. I mean, it almost cost them multiple regular season games. The only reason Alabama didn't lose in the same fashion as Michigan did this year was because Texas's secondary was awful last year. Oklahoma abused that secondary. TCU nearly came back and won because of that DB room. Half the reason Oklahoma State even scored points in that game against Texas was because of the secondary. It's why Washington in an alternate universe could have beat them by 20 points. I mean, we can go on and on and on. It was a horrific weakness. It was a defense that in a lot of aspects was a top 10, top 15, top 20, at worst top 25 unit that was ruined by a very weak and crippling secondary. That's not the case with this Texas unit. The DB room is totally flipped. The D-line, the defensive front, is still very strong, athletic, quick, well-coordinated, well-coached. Georgia's passing attack has been worse than it was last year. I don't think they have an alpha player. I think they have a lot of good players, which helps against a Georgia Tech defense that, got injured throughout the game and just doesn't have high-caliber athletes yet. First year of a new defensive coordinator. it helps against, let's say, Florida or Kentucky, where you have that talent edge over Kentucky. So even though they get a lot of TOP and outplay you in some regards, your talent is just enough to push you over. Just enough. So that's the key matchup for me here, because Texas, it is a question if their offense can even get going, perhaps, against this Georgia defense. But while Texas does have a lot of brokenness on offense, Texas has the non-negotiable side of the ball in this game. Their defense, let's just look at this right here. They are number 2 in opponent points per game, allowing 11.7, only behind Ohio State. They allow 0.18 points per play, second. They have 21.2 opponent yards per point. That means opponents have to gain over 2 first downs to score a single point on this team. That's fourth. You look at opponent red zone score attempts per game, they are second there, allowing 2.2. They only allow 1.3 red zone scores per game, which is 1, and they're second in red zone scoring percentage, only allowing a 57.69% red zone scoring percentage. They're only behind OSU in those categories that I mentioned for the most part. They're up there with Ohio State. I think it's Ohio State and Texas who have the best defenses in college football right now, and maybe Penn State, and you could put Oregon, or you could put Georgia, or some would put Ole Miss up there, and they have a lot of talent. But regardless of where you were ordering Texas's defense, it is a non-negotiable. I mean, they didn't allow A&M to score a single offensive point, and A&M's offense all year, while not awesome, has been good. It's better than A&M's offense last year, and they have some nice players and an improved offensive line and some good receivers and great running backs, and Texas just shut them down. Texas is number 1 in opponent yards per play, only allowing 3.8. And I can go on and on. I mean, they only allow 3.1 yards per carry on the ground, 5.1 yards per pass attempt, which is first, and 8.8 yards per completion, which is first. Georgia, in all of those categories that I mentioned, by the way, literally all of them, is outside of the top 25. Now, a huge part of that is because of their strength of schedule. I mean, you look at defensive efficiency metrics, Georgia's top 10. You watch the film, Georgia, at least I would say, is a top 15 defense. And I think the reason Tech was able to get at them is because Tech has a top 10 offense when Haynes King is healthy. That helps a lot. And Georgia Tech is physical in the trenches. And if you get a physicality edge over Georgia, it's similar with every defense, but I've noticed whether it's Bama last year, Bama in 21, or not Ohio State in 22, but they were able to match enough pound for pound with Georgia, where if you can beat Georgia physically, you will score points on them. And I think that's sort of redundant, but I feel like that's even more so the case, where Kirby Smart and his coordinators want to make life easier for everyone and just care about, getting bodies and care about making sure your players are the best players in the country, because that makes everything else easier. That's the critical matchup here, is that Texas defense against a Georgia offense that is scoring 32.8 points per game, which is 28th. They average 0.469 points per play, 24th. And really the passing offense, where you look at Georgia, they're only averaging 4.1 yards per carry. They can't run the football. It's the same thing with OSU. They can't run the football. Georgia allows a 3.94 sack percentage, which is 24th, and they're averaging 7.8 yards per pass attempt, 34th, 12.1 yards per completion, which is 62nd. What can Carson Beck do? Does Carson Beck continue his streak of not throwing interceptions? I don't think he's thrown a single interception since Ole Miss. He hasn't. He did very well against Tennessee. UMass did well in the second half against Georgia Tech after a very rough first half start. What kind of Carson Beck shows up? Does he make multiple turnovers? Does he have a mostly clean game after maybe being inconsistent? Because he never has a complete 100% game. It's similar with Quinn Ewers. And then what Texas defense shows up? Can they carry their offense a bit? Can Georgia lean on them for 2 or 3 quarters and Texas doesn't break on the defensive side of the ball? Those are going to be some questions that will be answered, and depending on how they're answered, will tip the cap to Georgia or to Texas and give them a bye and potentially for Texas, the number 1 seed in the college football playoff. You look at the offensive breakdown, I think that Texas, and this is just talking about players and how they've performed. This is not talking about coaching, just players and what I have seen. I think that Texas is better at running back. I think they're better at receiver. I think when Texas is on the offensive line, they are better. And an area where there's a push is quarterback and tight end. If I had to lean one way or the other, right now, I would say Georgia's better at quarterback. I think that Beck has been playing better recently than Ewers has. And at tight end, I'd say depth goes to Georgia, but Gunnar Helm leads the team in receiving yards with 605 touchdowns and 48 receptions. I think he's the best individual tight end on both teams right now. But Georgia does have better depth. I don't know which matters more because these teams, of course, they run different schemes. They're their own team and depth chart, obviously. But I'd probably lean Georgia at quarterback if I had to choose, although I think it's very tight. That's why it's a push. And I'd slightly lean Texas at tight end. Quarterback and the offensive line are the most important positions on offense. If you have a good QB, as long as your skill position players aren't terrible, you can get them the ball. If you have a good offensive line, if your running back room is banged up like Texas's is, as long as one of the running backs does find a way to be productive, that's Texas's Quintrevion Wisner with 812 rushing yards, 5.2 yards per carry, and 3 touchdowns. Blue is also averaging over 5 yards per carry, same with Jarrett Gibson. You can have enough of a rushing attack to keep opposing defenses honest. I mean, Texas, they're averaging 4.7 yards per carry, and they have 21 rushing touchdowns. That's actually not too far off from Ohio State's rushing offense, and Texas does not have anywhere close to the running backs OSU does. And Texas has been trending up in running the football. They've been getting better and better. Ohio State's getting worse. And that right there is a they're complete polar opposites. Texas has the elite offensive line and a running back room that I'd say is less than desirable for a team of their caliber. Ohio State, they have elite running backs and an offensive line that is less than desirable for a team of their caliber. You'd much rather be Texas right now in running the football because that also means you can better pass protect. You will have an easier time picking up yardage, chunk yardage in particular, short yardage, have a better time getting push. You'll have a more consistent rushing offense and a more consistent offense overall, assuming that other things work in your direction because quarterback play for Texas has been incredibly inconsistent. But I think Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, DeAndre Moore, Ryan Wingo, Silas Bolden, and Jahdae Cook are better than Georgia's Dylan Bell, Arian Smith, who's been wildly inconsistent his entire career, Dominic Lovett, and London Humphreys. And I do believe that at guard, tackle, center, that Kelvin Banks Jr., Hayden Connor, Jake Majors, DJ Campbell, and Cameron Williams are better than Ernest Green III, Dylan Fairchild, Jared Wilson, Tate Ratledge, and Xavier Truss. We already talked about tight end. Look for Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky and Ben Urasek to be involved. They have a lot of depth at tight end. But Texas does also have Gunnar Helm, who's done a very good job this season. I love him in yards after catch, yards after contact situations where he's so big and tough and aware of his surroundings that he can, whether it's hurdling people, stiff arming, or falling forward for extra yards, I think he does a very good job on the field, not just catching the ball, but working after the catch to put his team in better positions. Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck, it's just the story of inconsistency, kind of the story of what if. They have on the year 52 combined touchdowns and almost 6,000 combined passing yards, but it's on exactly 741 attempts, and they have 19 interceptions combined. Carson Beck has 12, Ewers has 7, and it's been a game of up and down for both of these QBs. I'm very curious how these offenses function in this game. Which defense can make their opponent's quarterback uncomfortable quicker or be the straw that breaks the camel's back? Who can get a pick six? Whose DBs can do a better job at catching the football? That might be an underrated characteristic of what will determine the winner of this football game. because these quarterbacks do throw risky passes, and they sometimes trust their receivers too much or force things because part of me actually believes these two quarterbacks think that because of the talent they have, that they should just be able to throw the football and just get away with any mistakes. I mean, I watch Carson Beck play, and sometimes that's the case, just throwing things into tight windows and saying, well, we're Georgia, so we should catch this. And it's like, that's good, and you like that. Like, I think against Georgia Tech and Tennessee, that turned out to be good. He was aggressive, it worked, he threw the perfect ball, and it really helped open up the opposing defenses and help Georgia win. But there are other games like Florida where it's like, guy, you're costing your team points and you're keeping the opponent in the game or putting them in a position to win, and it's just frustrating. And I think it's a similar situation with Quinn Ewers as well. So keep that in mind. Who has more dropped interceptions? Who catches a higher percentage of their potential interceptions on defense? That team who catches more of them probably wins the game, I think, because I think there will be turnover opportunities through the year for these defenses. And speaking of defenses, I do think that Texas's pass defense is better, just watching these two teams. I mean, look at it this way. When these two teams matched up in Austin, Georgia didn't throw any passing touchdowns, and they actually averaged fewer yards per pass attempt than Texas did. And Texas had 2 passing touchdowns. Now, overall, Georgia, won the football game. But I've been very impressed with Texas's defensive backs, especially since, I would say, middle of the year against Georgia, it became apparent that they were legit because Georgia was the best offense they had played all season long up to that point, and really the best offense they have faced all season long. Georgia, they've struggled a bit in defending the pass. Not necessarily in defending the run, at least to the same degree. Georgia Tech was able to have a lot of success running on them, but again, Georgia Tech is one of the nation's best offensive lines and best rushing attacks and also best quarterbacks when everyone is healthy. And Georgia has played Alabama, who was at their peak, I think, when they played Georgia. They played Ole Miss, who was able to run the football on Georgia a little bit, and I credit that to the athletes they have and also the fact that they were able to just pass on Georgia at will, so they passed to open up the run. You also got to think of, like, they played Tennessee, who has Dylan Sampson, another great rushing offense. They also played Clemson, who has had a fairly good rushing offense this year. And then, of course, Georgia Tech, who is one of the better rushing offenses in the country. So I think the statistics provide a negative bias against Georgia in stopping the run. You'll allow opponents to average 4 yards per carry. On passing defense, though, a 6.7 yards per pass attempt allowed, 41st, and they're 46th in opponent yards per completion, allowing 11.5. Their opponent average team passer rating is a 123. That's 38th. And they only have a 7.2 sack percentage, which is 39th. Texas, meanwhile, is a 9.2 a sack percentage. And Georgia, they allow their opponents to complete nearly 60% of their throws, 58.62 to be exact. Texas is pretty close, but still just a little bit ahead of them there. I do think that up front there are questions. I like Barron Sorrell. I love Alfred Collins, definitely an All-American defensive tackle. Bill Norton and Vernon Broughton on their defensive line, and also Trey Moore at edge. You look, though, at Georgia, and Michael Williams, Nazir Stackhouse, Chaz Chambliss, Christian Miller, Warren Brinson, Damon Wilson. They have depth. They have serious depth on the defensive line, and I think that Georgia's D-line this season is closer to their 2021 and 2022 counterparts than they are to their 2023 counterparts. They have made massive strides up front this year, which was a goal of Kirby Smart in the preseason, and I think maybe not completely, but to a certain degree they have met that goal. So it's a push. If you put a gun to my head, the analytics would scream Texas there, the better sack production, better at stopping the run, but also Georgia's defense has been put into tougher positions based off of, who they've played, stronger strength of schedule, and they have an inferior backfield on defense compared to Texas. So if you put a gun to my head, I would actually pick Georgia here up front on the defensive line, especially, I think I would say at defensive end. I think on the interior at D tackle, if you forced my hand, I'd probably pick Texas with Alfred Collins. But overall, for the entire D line, both at DN, D tackle, it's a push. It's very competitive there. I think that David Gbenda, Anthony Hill Jr., the speed that they have at linebacker, the maturity there, the talent is very impressive, but C.J. Allen and Smael Mondon Jr. are pretty good as well. And at secondary, Jahdae Barron's been one of the better corners in the country. Same with Malik Muhammad, Michael Tafi, Andrew Makuba, and Jalen Gilbo. I think they're better than Dalen Everett, KJ Bolden, Malachi Sturks, Julian Humphrey, and Joniel Aguero. But these defenses are some of the nation's best. They're top 10 in ESPN's efficiency on defense, so that certainly counts as something. I look at the trenches. I would pick Texas to be better. I know that Georgia, they dominated them in the regular season, but it's hard to beat a good team twice at the same thing. And I think that may have been a shell shock moment for Texas, where just the step up in competition was massive, very massive, and the offense for Texas was horrific in that game. It constantly put the defense in bad positions. It did not look like normal Texas. I will say that. And I think that just watching both of these teams play, how Georgia has been very up and down in the trenches. Sometimes their O-line looks elite. Other times it looks garbage. Their defensive line, I think, is a near elite unit. It's better than it was last year, but Georgia Tech pushed them around. Alabama pushed them around up front. And I mean, Kentucky did a better job in the trenches for much of that game against Georgia than Georgia did. We have a large sample set of Georgia's trench play being inconsistent. We also have a large sample set, though, of Kirby Smart stepping up in big games, not named Alabama, or also for this year as an exception, Ole Miss on the road. And this is more of a home environment. So I think Georgia, in a way, is kind of Jekyll and Hyde, where on the road they struggle a lot more than at home, and it's just more pronounced than the usual team. But Texas, I would say that they're better in the trenches nonetheless, and the reason I mentioned that is because, like, going back to the home field advantage part, this will be somewhat of a home game for Georgia, but it's also neutral site, so it's weird. Special teams, though, special teams efficiency easily goes to the Georgia Bulldogs. Looking at coaching, I think that Kirby Smart is better than Steve Sarkisian, and I think Georgia has better strength and conditioning. I think that Texas does have the better offensive coaching staff, though, and as for the defensive staff, I don't know who to pick defensively. Truly, I don't. Like, I couldn't tell you where I would lean. I'm thinking about it right now, though, but I couldn't tell you where I would lean here. I think that both staffs have done a tremendous job, for the most part, with their defensive talent. I would lean Texas, now that I think about it, if you forced my hand. But again, Georgia's played that tougher strength of schedule, and especially they've played tougher offenses. So I don't know if there's a negative bias against the defense that if you were to adjust for, they'd be better than Texas on defense, or at least pretty close. But because of the job that Texas has done defensively this year, I would lean toward the Longhorns for defensive staff. Ultimately, my prediction is that it's going to be a low-scoring game. My model says Texas by about 3.5. I'm going to pick Texas to cover, and I'm going to pick them to win because, especially with the limitations that Georgia has, I think it's hard to beat a good team twice. If this were Oregon versus Ohio State, where you look at those teams and how they've trended since their matchup, Oregon stayed about the same, if not gotten better and healthier. Ohio State has gotten worse and not as healthy. That would be a different story. If those two teams matched up in Indianapolis, I'd probably pick Oregon by 7. Still a pretty competitive game, but Oregon looking better against OSU than they did earlier in the season. This game is a little bit different. I think that Texas's defense continues to get better week over week over week. I think that now, since Texas has played a team of Georgia's caliber, they're going to be better prepared for what Georgia's going to bring in the trenches. I think that Carson Beck, this is the toughest defense he's played all season long. And 0 touchdowns, 3 picks. I'm not factoring in that much because I think that Beck will throw a touchdown, the team's only touchdown of the game, because I think Texas wins 20-13. And I don't think he throws 3 interceptions either. But I think both of these quarterbacks play better than they did in the regular season matchup. I think that Texas's defense has a higher ceiling. I think that Texas does a better job of controlling things than Georgia does. We've seen Georgia twice this year. Things get out of hand very quickly, and you just know it's over. They were very fortunate to get back in that Alabama game, and the minute they took the lead over Bama, it was pretty, easy for Bama to just hit the nope button and beat them. I think I said after that Georgia-Texas game that I wouldn't doubt Kirby Smart again, and I don't think I am here. Maybe so. But the way I see it, I think that Texas is better on frankly both sides of the football, if I'm being honest here. And again, it's hard to beat a good team twice. And thanks to Texas's easier schedule, I do think the Longhorns are healthier here. That's a benefit of playing an easier schedule. Yes, you may not know what the team actually is or who they are, but when you play tough schedules like Georgia, and I think Ohio State in part was a story of this season, although the Seth McLaughlin injury was due to off-field practice reasons, you can get banged up quicker because you're playing harder football. And Georgia has been a team that I think the Ole Miss game was the epitome of, they just kind of snapped because they were playing such a tough schedule and it was just too much. I don't think that happens here. I think Georgia plays close to their A game. I just also think Texas does, and I think Texas at their A game is better than Georgia at their A game. So Texas wins 20-13. Would not be shocked at all if Georgia wins, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Make sure to check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the link in the description down below in the pinned comment. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connell OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lee and Ismar and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Steele, Austin Christmas, Josh Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Again, make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment your thoughts down below, and join our Discord server. And I will see you all soon. Go Longhorns, and go Bulldogs.